Good morning, everyone. All right, now welcome to the Atlantic Ocean. And you have to, as time will go on over the next few days, you're going to learn a thing called the Atlantic Shuffle. That's where you keep your feet a little bit further apart and you kind of waddle along. It makes for a little better stability. Anyway, I'd like to welcome you to another in a series of presentations that I'm giving over the course of the cruise. I'm still Don. And I hope you found the lectures so far to be somewhat entertaining and maybe a little bit informational. Upcoming presentations are going to be a little different. We've got some more about the places we're going to visit after we leave Madeira, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the place that we are, the ocean, the sea. We're going to talk about some ships. We're going to talk about my favorite destination of all, the Bermuda Triangle. Anyway, we're going to have some fun, and let's go on now and talk a little bit about Funchal and Madeira. Basically, Funchal and Madeira are part of a series of islands, and it's an autonomous region of Portugal. I mean, there's a lot of countries that have these autonomous regions, but this one is known primarily for its scenic beauty, its wine, and its climate. And when we get there, you'll understand all of that a little bit better. So we're going to talk first a little bit about its origins. The Madeira Islands, along with the Canary Islands and Cape Verde, are part of what is known as Micronesia Archipelago, as opposed to Micronesia that's over on the other side of the world. This one's Micronesia. It's about a 1,700 kilometer long volcanic belt along the coast of West Africa. And it's kind of outlined in red there. I made it a little easier to see. Just for those of us who are metrically challenged, that's 1,000 miles. The belt consists of basically 4 archipelagos, and there's more than 20 large seamounts. Now, seamounts are just big, they used to be islands. They were volcanic peaks that came up in the ocean, and then weather and erosion wore them back down, so now they're back down under the surface again. So basically, they're just big bumps on the bottom of the ocean. But the islands themselves have pretty much similar natural and cultural history. They have peaks that go up to about 1,860 meters or 6,100 feet, and they're all of volcanic origin, and they were all created, all the islands in this chain right here were created in the same way. There's a high level of geologic activity in the area that's a result of the junction of 3 major tectonic plates, the South American plate, the African plate, and the Caribbean plate. Everybody goes, oh, excuse me, not South American, South African, I think. I said South American. Anyway, most volcanic islands, though, usually show up along these seams where these plates come together. They're found at those boundaries because that's where the most volcanic or seismic activity occurs. And the Azores is right at the place where those 3 plates come together. And it's happening because the plates are trying to pull apart and it's sending things up. But the Micronesia Archipelago wasn't formed at the boundary of a plate. It's pretty much in the mid-plate of the African plate itself. And it's at a place called a hot spot. Now, a hot spot is basically a geologic zone where very hot magma from underneath the crust basically creates a volcano when it finds a weak spot in the crust itself. And as the plate moves over that hot spot, it creates volcanoes. And those volcanoes, if they rise high enough, eventually, if it's an oceanic plate, become islands. Now, I'm using this as an example because it's the best one I could find, and it's also an easy one to understand because most people know that the Hawaiian Islands came about as a result of a hot spot. A hot spot is located, as I said, in the Earth's mantle. That's the big chunk of mass that's below the crust itself. Here the molten magma basically has a very hot point that pushes up through the rest of the magma itself, pushes against the bottom of the plate. And over time, as the plate moves, it will show a weak spot. When it gets the weak spot, that volcano will break through and come up. Now, those plates move, at least the plates where these hot spots exist, they move at about 2 inches a year, so they're not exactly dynamic and very fast. But the sequence, you can kind of see, goes like this. First an island will be formed, and then a hot spot moves, and another island gets formed, and a hot spot moves, and so on. And it takes millions of years for this to happen. To give you an idea, Kauai, which is now way off to the west compared to the hotspot, northwest actually began 4.6 million years ago. And that's when that hot liquid came up and pushed up through the bottom of the plate. And that's the same thing that happened in Madeira, the same thing that happened in the Canary Islands. And it happens over and over again. Now, in the case of Micronesia, the hotspot has been active for about 70 million years. It's almost as old as I am. Madeira was formed about 18 million years ago as the African plate itself moved across that hotspot. Now, pretty much fortunately for us, volcanic activity here stopped about 6,500 years ago. So you won't see anything really spectacular unless there's a new eruption, but they don't expect anything like that to happen because the hotspot has moved. Actually, the hotspot didn't move, we did. Today, only about the top quarter of Madeira itself is above the water. If you go from the water down, there's about 6,000 feet or some 1,800 meters of water till you get down to the bottom. So it's a pretty tall island when you think about it from the bottom to the top. So, you know, you're talking thousands and thousands of feet. Now, the summit here is pretty spectacular. If you get up to the summit, it provides some really spectacular and wonderful views of the entire island. You could climb to the top of Pico Rivo. It's challenging. If you do that, please send back film. But there are also some other routes that have varying degrees of difficulty. One, you can drive almost to the summit and then do a little bit of a climb. The other, if you really, really want to do it, you could take a cab and drive right to the summit. So it makes it a lot easier. Anyway, the peak is accessible only by very steep ridges and hairpin turns. So if you're into motion sickness, that probably wouldn't be a really enjoyable trip because that road passes through tunnels and winds back and forth across the top of those cliffs. But with its volcanic history, you can kind of see this is a pretty spectacular island. The coastline is very steep and very rocky. And there's this kind of a volcanic amphitheater, if you will, that surrounds Funchal Harbor. When we get in there, you'll see all around us will be mountains that were formed by the volcano because Funchal itself sits in what was once a caldera. That's that basin bowl that happens after the center of a volcano caves back in on itself. Now, for the non-hikers, the volcanic origin, actually, it's easiest to see. You can go up to this Kejiro. It's located just west of Funchal. There's a nearly vertical cliff. It's not nearly vertical, it is vertical. It's about 580 meters or 2,000 feet high. When you lean out over the edge to take pictures, you get a little bit of vertigo. So to help people out, they actually built a glass platform. And you can walk out on that glass platform and look right straight down through the glass. It's really pretty spectacular. Now, way down at the bottom, there are fields that the farmers have for their crops. And originally, the only way they could get to those fields was by boat. But, you know, the nice government here decided that they could put in a cable car that would reach down to the fields. So back in 2012, they started using a cable car back and forth. And that's also when the glass platform was put out so the visitors could walk out and look straight down. It actually is kind of a neat place to go. I have to tell you, it's a very enjoyable place. The São Vicente caves on Madeira actually they're pipes that were left behind during the last volcanic eruptions. Now, how long ago was that? 6,500 years. Now, what happened was very hot liquid lava came out of the volcano. And on the top, it kind of crusted over. It cooled in the air, and it formed like a big tube or pipe that would just kind of let the hot liquid keep flowing. Well, then the volcano decided to turn off the valve, and it did it quite quickly, and all of that hot lava just drained out of those tubes, and it left behind these wonderful caves. Basically, they're called lava tubes, but today they have really neat things inside. These caves were discovered, São Vicente caves were discovered back in 1885, but they weren't open to the public until about maybe 20 years ago, 1995 or so. Today you can actually go inside and you can see 8 different tunnels that are related to this cave system, and inside the tunnels they have lakes and stalactites and stalagmites and all that kind of stuff. And right near here is also a volcanism center that has a really good audio-visual show that gives you a lot of geological information about Madeira and the rest of the islands in the area. All of volcanic activity here has really blessed Macronesia, excuse me, with a really fertile landscape. Until comparatively recently, most of these islands were covered in ancient subtropical forests, mostly rainforest because of their location. And it's a region, the reason the name of the island of Madeira came to what it is when the Portuguese explorers got here, they saw forests. So they named the island Wood. No, they named it Madeira because that's wood in Portuguese. Anyway, parts of the rainforest here are called Laura Silva, and just a small parts of those still remain. It's a type of a subtropical forest that's found in areas with very high humidity and a pretty standard flat, almost subtropical mild temperatures. It has to have a stable temperature environment to succeed. The forest is characterized by some broadleaf tree species that are all evergreen, and they have glossy, elongated leaves. And they're all in the kind of what we think of as the laurel family, and all the leaves have a little bit of a layer of wax on them. It makes them look pretty glossy in appearance. It makes them look almost wet. Well, because they are. Anyway, the Laura Silva forests here are now protected because they're all World Heritage Sites. The nutrients from the volcano also support vast schools of sea life. The local fishermen here are world-renowned. The fish here is wonderful, and if we're fortunate, I think we will be, because it always happens this way. The chef will go ashore, find a fish market, and tomorrow night we're probably going to have some fresh fish on the menu. Anyway, they use 2 different kinds of hook and line techniques here. And they're very distinct versions. The first is trolling. They use small boats like this. They use baited hooks that are streamed aft from the boat as the boat steams slowly along, and they catch fish, and they bring the fish aboard where it's iced down and then taken into port. The most common fish that they catch doing it that way is tuna. Now the second, they use baited hooks, and they're basically called a long line technique. Now these long lines, they are spread along the sea floor. What happens is the boat will drop a buoy or a float with a radio transponder on it, and it has a line that goes down, and then they feed out all of this line that goes along the bottom of the sea, has hooks and so on attached to it till they get to the other end, and then that has another set of floats on it when they drop that off. Then the boat turns around and goes back to the very beginning. To give you an idea, this thing could be 2, 3, maybe even 4 miles long or longer on a really big boat. So it's a lot of line. Anyway, they go back to the original float, they pick it up, and then they pull in the hooks with the fish on it. Then they go into port and they sell the fish to us so we can have it tomorrow in the terrace. Now the abundant local fish stocks also bring about large numbers of some pretty good sized marine mammals such as whales and dolphins. Now just 3.5 miles to 5 kilometers off of Madeira's coast, the ocean reaches a depth of more than 3,000 meters, 9,500 feet. The conditions here are particularly suitable for sperm whales because they look at this as the perfect nursery. There's not a lot of predators here. The waters are nice. There's a lot of fish, a lot of food to eat. And you can also often see them in groups of some 15 to 20 animals. And these are big animals. You can't miss them. They're one of the largest animals that has ever lived in the history of the world, and they're easily recognized by this massive head and a prominent rounded forehead that sticks out. And they have the largest brain of any animal that has ever lived on Earth. Now the heads also hold a large quantity of an oily liquid called spermaceti. Whalers once believed that it was sperm, but we won't go there. And the scientists still don't really understand what that oil was used for. One theory is that it stays fluid when it's warm, and as it gets colder and colder, it gets harder. And they think that that's used to help the whale with its buoyancy and its ability to dive to great depths, because they can dive almost to the seafloor itself. The other thing that's interesting about these giant animals is that they can hold their breath for 90 minutes. I tried to get my wife to do that, but she fought me. They're driven by these tail flukes. Their tails are huge, they're gigantic, and they can cruise the ocean at about 23 knots. That's faster than we can go. And that's about 42 kilometers or 26 miles an hour, something like that. So it's a pretty quick whale. They're really interesting, but I will tell you right now, just as I always say when I talk about wildlife sightings are not guaranteed. And I can almost guarantee when somebody sees a whale and everybody runs to that side of the ship, the whales will be gone. Now, when the Europeans began to explore Micronesia, they encountered indigenous populations that lived in a pretty much a Neolithic or a Stone Age level. These people were pretty primitive. Linguistic and genetic analysis, though, has indicated that at least some of those people share common origins or ancestors with the Berbers from North Africa. And they're not really sure how they got here. They think they came here by boat, but they're not really sure because it was a long, long time ago. And archaeological evidence also suggests that Madeira may have been visited by the Vikings sometime around 1030 in the Common Era, or AD if you prefer. And that's based on the carbon dating of some Scandinavian mice bones that were found here. All right, who gives a hoot about mice bones? And what kind of scientists study that? All right. Yeah, inquiring minds want to know. Anyway, the pre-colonial people were known as the Guanches. Modern DNA suggests that the Guanches arrived in Madeira via the Canary Islands. So they went from the mainland over to the Canaries and finally ended up here. Madeira was mentioned very early in our written history. In 75 in the Common Era, AD, Plutarch referred to one of the Roman military commanders who called them, quote, the Isles of the Blessed, unquote. Roman historian Pliny talked about, quote, the Purple Islands, unquote. And that was actually, he said it was purple, but it was actually in reference to some red dye that was made here. The Madeira archipelago was the first territory, I shouldn't say discovered, I should say rediscovered by the Portuguese during their age of discovery. It was claimed by Portuguese sailors in the service of Prince Henry the Navigator in 1419. Now, he was pretty well known in Lisbon because he provided financial support to explorers, he constructed new ships, and he developed many new navigational schools. To his school of navigators, he brought cosmographers, mathematicians, and cartographers or map makers. They studied the sea, they studied weather, ships, geography, and trade routes. And he also had information coming back from explorers from all over the world. So even if they didn't head out to discover Madeira, you have to know this, they didn't go there intentionally. They got caught in a storm and got blown off course, and this is where they ended up. Now, as I said earlier, Madeira, people go, well, Madeira, where'd that name come from? Well, the island was so covered with trees, as I said, the Portuguese settlers called it Wood, or Madeira. Madeira was settled by Portuguese farmers who were sent here by the King of Portugal, and they soon developed pretty much their own distinct identity and culture. They basically had started to drift away a little bit from what they had had back home. They took possession of the island on behalf of the crown. And then a little bit later, enslaved Africans were brought from the mainland to supply labor and to build the settlements themselves. A great deal of land was brought under cultivation here. The dense forests were cut down and burned, a lot of it anyway, and the fires were reported to have burned for 7 continuous years. That's a lot of forest that got burned. Anyway, it left the ground covered with a rich layer of wood ash, which actually helped the fertility a little bit more. And that proved very beneficial for the growing of grapes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the grapes in a minute. The early settlers colonized Funchal around the same time. Now, the Portuguese word Funchal means fennel, and it grew all over here. It was a weed, still is a weed, And it gave the name to the area Funchal, because they came in and they had all these lovely yellow flowers that smelled a little bit like licorice. You can look for it as you travel around the island. It's still here. They haven't been able to get rid of it, and I don't think they want to. It's a perennial. It has long, straight stems, as you little clusters of yellow flower-like things at the top. They can get to be about 2 meters, 6 feet or so high. The leaves are kind of a bluish green, mostly green, but have a little bit of a blue tint to them. And the leaves are pretty long and slender. The bulb of the plant actually is the thing that most people like, because it has a kind of a licorice taste to it. It's very firm and crunchy. And like I said, it has a kind of a licorice or an anise taste to it. The plant is believed to have many, many health benefits because it acts in the digestive tract. It decreases abdominal pain and gas, and it prevents spasms or cramping throughout the body. Probably find me eating a bulb or two of it when I have dinner ashore. We have Prince Henry to thank for something else, and that's the backing of the wine culture here. It appeared in Madeira during the very early settlement eras. Originally, they made the wine as sacramental wine, but it was a little bit later on that they changed off of that. They were first introduced here in the 15th century. The sugar cane that they used as a part of that was brought here from Sicily, and then they brought the sweet Malvasia grapes from Cyprus and Crete. Originally, the vines, as I said, were to make wine for celebrating Mass, and they weren't really used for personal consumption, but somebody figured out that maybe I'd like to have a little bit of that for dessert, or maybe a little bit with dinner, or maybe a little bit before dinner, or maybe a little bit right after breakfast, or whatever. And more than one Venetian navigator referred to the excellence of the wines that came from Madeira. Some of the vineyards use modern trellises, wire trellises, but most are still grown in these cures, or terraces, across the island. And as you're going out on tours, when you get out of the city, you'll see all of these little kind of corrals, if you will, that are made with stone walls that are piled up all around them. And those stone walls are there to protect the vines from the constant winds. The wind is just constant in the area. You'll see these all over the place. Mostly you will find these vineyards on the north coast of the island, and interestingly enough, the vineyards are all located on hillsides that face to the south. So you'd think that they'd be on the south coast, it'd be easier, but no, they go on the north coast because the territory is a little easier to plant. But there's very little rainfall here, and they do have to do some irrigation, but most of the fact is the soil is very porous and it holds a lot of water like a big sponge, and the grapes are grown all over here. If you go to the old Blandy Wine Lodge, it's right in downtown Madeira, or Funchal, excuse me. It's in the center part of the city. The lodge was bought originally by a man named Charles Blandy back in 1840. And not only was it extremely valuable property at the time, but it was directly connected to the family's own townhouse. So, I mean, they bought this and they lived right next door, so it was convenient for their commute. Each of the lodge's rooms has its own character. We're talking, in this case, the wine lodge where they stored the different wine. And because of varying temperatures and humidity, the wines in each of those rooms all have very different aging profiles that are based on their location within the lodge. So if it's in a warmer room, it's going to taste different than it does if it comes from a cooler room. The lodge's museum has artifacts that include coins from Blandy's own bank, as well as letters from Sir Winston Churchill, who was known to maybe have a little bit of Madeira wine. They also have the island's oldest wooden lager. Now, a lot of people think lager has to do with beer, but in this case, lager was the big kind of a half-barrel thing that people jumped into and squashed used their feet to squash the grapes. So they still have that. It actually came from back in the 17th century. I'm not sure they still use it. I don't think so. But in the old days, the people stomped on it in their bare feet. Today, there's tours of the lodge that they actually charge a nominal fee, but of course, the tasting rooms are free, but the wine isn't. So you can walk into the tasting room and then buy a sample. Anyway, By the end of the 16th century, William Shakespeare cited the important, I'm not sure if it's important, but the notoriety of the Madeira Malvasia wines. They were otherwise known as the Butt of Malmsey. Doesn't that sound like something you really want to drink? The Butt of Malmsey. I really want to drink that. Anyway, in his play Richard III, Richard's brother was selected to be drowned in Madeira wine. I guess if you're going to go, that's probably as good a way as any. It's one of the most popular myths in English history, and also it sold a lot of wine. The execution, in whatever form it took, was actually carried out in the Tower of London, so I don't know if they had a wine cellar there or not. In Henry IV, Shakespeare again was a spokesperson, or I guess an ad man for Madeira wines. In that particular case, Falstaff was censured for having sold his soul to the devil for a cup of Madeira wine. Maybe that's where my soul went. When Funchal built a lighthouse, it became an important stop for European commercial interest. Christopher Columbus was one of the very early settlers that came here. And in 1478, he came to Madeira, and he worked remember 1478 was a little bit before he did the other thing. He was working in the sugar trade, and his basic business was sailing between Madeira and Lisbon, carrying sugar and sugar cane, and bringing money back, of course. Madeira became the world's greatest producer of sugar at the time, and the islands pretty soon attracted a lot of merchants, pirates, adventurers from all over Europe. People really found this was the place to go. Now, Columbus actually lived here, and he married a woman named Filipa. She was the daughter of the first governor of Porto Santo in the islands. They had a child, a son named Diego, who was born here. And Columbus stayed here for some time, and he had a lot of contacts, and he used a lot of the information that he got while he lived here to get more and more data about the Atlantic Ocean itself. He learned about the winds, the currents, all that kind of stuff. And it was only after the untimely death of his wife that he left the islands for good. That's not that he never came back, because he did come back, because with Madeiran history being so deeply entwined with that of Christopher Columbus, it was just a matter of time after the whole thing took place that a replica of his galleon would be built. The Santa Maria that's shown here isn't exactly the same one that he used in 1492. It was built by a local Dutchman and some craftsmen, and they finished it back in 1998. If it's in port, if you're up on one of the high parts of the island, you can see it, or if you really want to, you could always go over, and they do little sailing tours out in the harbor on it. But they don't necessarily go by sail, because it's not like Columbus's original boat. It has a motor, and it goes put, 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 put as it goes out of the harbor. Columbus, now an admiral and a viceroy of the Indies, was on his third voyage to America when he stopped in Madeira, just kind of to get some, I guess, pick up a couple of bottles of wine and maybe some other stuff for his trip. This time he stayed for 6 days. And there's a century-old tradition on the island that says he stayed in a house on Funchal. Now, unfortunately, somebody burned that house to the ground in 1876, but nonetheless, Columbus was, quote, given a great welcome with celebrations because he was known there and having lived there some time previously, unquote. So they really liked him here on the island. They really respected him. At the time, Funchal was elevated to the status of city by King Manuel I of Portugal. The Sé Cathedral, that's shown here, was constructed. It took about 50 years to complete. The church is one of the few structures that survives and has survived basically intact since the very early period of colonization. It kind of looks pretty Gothic, but you've got to not think about how stark that exterior is, because the interior is stunning. The inlaid ceiling and a silver processional cross from the King Manuel are pretty impressive and noteworthy to see. The roof is a Mudéjar-inspired design. It's a little bit unusual because it's made from cedar wood. Mudéjar is the name that was given to the Moors who remained in Iberia after the Christian Reconquista. So basically, These were Moors who said they converted to Christianity, but really didn't. So they came down here, and the style of architecture that they used to build this cathedral is primarily Moorish. It influenced all of their workmanship. The exterior walls of the cathedral are made from stone that came from that place where they now have the glass platform out at Cabo Girao. Now, the sugar-based economy of Micronesia Islands all faced a pretty stiff competition from Spain's American colonies, because pretty soon the islands in the Caribbean were just rampant with sugar plantations. Low sugar prices caused a severe recession on the island, and a new source of cash that started with the prickly pear cactus, of all things, saved the island's economy. Everybody's saying, well, how could a cactus help anything? Well, it's actually the cochineal insects, these little guys. They live on a cactus, and they eat the red berries and fruit of the cactus. They're a soft-bodied little, like a beetle. They're flat. They're oval-shaped little bugs. The females are wingless. They're about 5 millimeters, or just under 1/4 of an inch long. There's a red dye called cochineal that's made from the dried bodies of the female insects. And that's the dye that Pliny was referring to. Specimens of it were carried to Spain back as early as the 1520s, and cloth merchants from Antwerp and all over Europe bought the cochineal in both insect and powdered form. And all of you are saying, well, what does that have to do with us? Well, this red dye plays a big role in our everyday lives. I know history probably doesn't decrease the gross out factor that I'm going to give you, but the red dye is in many of the things we eat. Oh, now they're looking forward to lunch, I can tell. So how do they turn these tiny critters into the food coloring that you use every day? Well, I don't know if you use it or not, but anyway, it's where red food coloring comes from. They're harvested, they're dried, they're ground. Starbucks, actually, you know, the coffee guys, they're coming under a lot of pressure from vegans and from PETA, among others, because they're using ground up bugs to cover their frappuccinos. Now, there's a little tidbit that I bet you didn't expect. Anyway, in addition to food coloring, cochineal is also used as a biological stain and as an indicator for acid-base titrations. Things to look for on food labels that include carminic acid. So when you're reading the labels of, I know everybody does this every day. I see them up at the buffet in the morning holding their cereal boxes, reading the ingredients. Anyway, look for carminic acid or cochineal extract. Red dye number 40 is, a lot of people mistake that for cochineal, but basically that's bug-free. That's made from coal. Another wonderful, tasty item. Anyway, that's according to Snopes. You know, those are the Mythbusters. That's more than you wanted to know. But it was an important part of Madeira's economy. Because of the lust for the Madeiran products, Funchal was vulnerable to privateers and pirate attacks. And the people always thought they were protected by the volcanic amphitheater that surrounded Funchal. It sits, as I said, once where there was a caldera that suffered a huge amount of extensive erosion. Back in 1566, French corsairs basically departed Bordeaux with a force of about 1,200 men, a small fleet with 3 ships and 8 support crafts, so to me that's 11 ships. Anyway, Funchal suffered a violent sack at the time that lasted for 15 days, after which very little remained of the city. Many English winemakers pretty soon moved to the island because they found that they could benefit from the Madeira wine. And they changed the economy here even more, and the lifestyle of Funchal in the city had a whole new merchant class. They built 3-story houses here, or homes here, and they basically had an intermediary service floor, a floor for storage, and wine cellars, and in some cases the houses had additional tower that was built above them to watch the port and monitor the ships that were coming in and out of the harbor, because they were looking for the ships that were going to take their wine away. Various island governors and convents tried their hand at commercial viticulture or winemaking. One of the most successful was the Campaña de Jesus, who developed a vast estate of Campanario. Now, these were nuns, And they financed ships that would carry their wines off to Brazil, and they would sell the wines in Brazil, and then they would get sugar in the Caribbean, and they would bring it back to Madeira, which they would then use for making sweets as well as for making more wine. To reach the New World, the wines passed through the tropics, which probably isn't a good thing for most wines. That heating that resulted basically came from the tropical sun because of the routes that they had to follow, and that gave what was normally thought of as a light kind of acetic wine, a kind of a depth of flavor, if you will. It was pleasantly burnt. Anyway, it was reasoned if one crossing of the equator was good for the wine, two had to be even better. So by the late 1700s, orders were given to put pipes, those were just big long tubes of wine, into the holds of ships. They actually used those pipes of wine as ballast, and they sent them on round-trip voyages to all parts of the world. That's kind of a rather unique way to age or mature wine, but it became known as vino de roda, or wine of the round voyage. Now, why those wines, which were exposed to constant rocking and motion, extreme heat, and the barrels were often found soaking down in bilge water, why the wine wasn't ruined is still kind of a mystery. Nobody knows for sure why. Now, if I tried something like this, the health department in California would put me out of business. Now, America grew really fond of Madeira wines, and it became one of the largest customers of all the wines that were produced here. It was so highly thought of that there was a riot in Boston. And I'm not talking about the Tea Party. This one happened 5 years before the Tea Party, and it came about because the local British authorities in Boston placed some heavy taxes on the wine from Madeira. Now, another little interesting fact is this wine was also used to toast the Declaration of Independence as well as to George Washington on his inauguration. Troops returning to Britain from the American War of Independence created kind of a class of connoisseurs of Madeira wine, and they took all of that back to Britain, and the demand in Britain started to increase. Ladies in Britain at the time were known to use it as perfume for their handkerchiefs. I never knew that wine could be a good perfume, but maybe it worked. Anyway, officers of the Royal Army and the Royal Navy demanded 15 bottles of Madeira wine a month for their personal consumption. And it is said to have some tonic value. It was recommended for sick or overworked people, and it actually got a nickname that was called Milk of the Old. Well, here comes the ad. Got milk? The wine industry was at its peak here in Madeira, and disaster struck in the form of a powdery mildew, or a thing called oidium. It almost destroyed all the grape production on Madeira. And the people didn't know at the time that the disease could be controlled simply by dusting the leaves with sulfur. Once they found that out, they were able to get some brief relief, and they started to rebuild the wine industry. And then a little louse called the phylloxera showed up, and it again just almost wiped out the rest of the grapes. But about 1863, 6,000 acres of vineyards had to be destroyed, and only about 20% of those were replaced with true Madeira wine. The rest were replanted, interestingly enough, with European and American hybrids that were more resistant to the bugs. Things settled down a bit in Madeira until World War I, and the Our Lady of Peace statue in Funchal actually commemorates the end of that war. There was a local priest here who promised to build a monument if peace should ever return to the island. Basically, in 1905, German plans were to build some hospitals and so on in Madeira, but the people in Madeira kind of saw through that. They knew that it was just Germany's attempt to do some colonization, and they basically blocked the whole thing, and the German property that was on the island was confiscated. But then in World War I, the German U-boat came into the harbor at Funchal, and it shelled the city for a couple of hours from about 2 miles away. Fortunately, the people in Madeira were able to fire back with their cannons, and they drove the sub off. But the sub was able to sink 3 ships before it was driven away. And then after the war in 1927, the priest who made the promise for the statue built that statue using anchor chain from the ships that had been sunk by the Germans. The evacuation of Gibraltar's memorial is in the center of Funchal, and that monument, actually, for those of you who went off yesterday, you probably saw a circle. It had a monument in the center of the circle. It had a bunch of islands' names. That's the monument on Gibraltar that commemorates what this commemorates. Basically, it was the people on Gibraltar who were evacuated because of the fear of the Second World War, and they were sent to places like Madeira, back to England, and so on. And that happened because Portugal was neutral during the war, but because they had an agreement with England, the Anglo-Portuguese agreement said that Madeira could help the Allies. I'm not quite sure how you get around that being a neutral country, but anyway, that's why Madeira was chosen as a place for the refugees from Gibraltar to go to. Unfortunately, even though the Germans had a plan called Operation Felix to basically overrun Gibraltar, that never occurred. Now, during the Second World War, Winston Churchill made plans for Britain to seize the Canary and the Madeira Islands as naval bases. He wanted these places for them. And that was in case Gibraltar was invaded from the Spanish mainland. At least he had the ability to put his ship someplace else to protect them. Now, the island of Madeira became a pretty special retreat for Churchill. In 1950, he was very tired, and I guess you'd say he was a battle-weary statesman, and he decided to take some time off and come down here to relax and rejuvenate his spirits. And of course, there were the spirits that were here. Churchill stayed at a place called Reed's Hotel. The suite that he occupied is named after him, and it's decorated with several of the oils that he painted while he was here. When he arrived, the English residents crowded all around the harbor, and they were shouting, "The man who saved the world!" Of course, Churchill, he didn't think anything of that. He was relaxed while he was here, and he painted seascapes and cliffs and so on. His health and demeanor improved, and pretty soon when he was walking around the island, people would greet him, and he'd give his V for victory salute. Following the Democratic Revolution in 1974, it's also called the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, the island was granted political autonomy. 4 years later, the Madeira flag was created. The blue symbolizes the ocean, the yellow stands for the abundant life on the island, and the red cross with the white center is the same cross that Prince Henry's fleet had on their sails and their captains wore on their breastplates. The region now has its own government and legislative assembly. Madeira is a self-governing. It's under the Portuguese constitution, but the inhabitants are, for all intents and purposes, Portuguese. They speak Portuguese, they vote in the Portuguese elections, and they celebrate Portuguese holidays. One other thing I should mention, while it's famous for its wine, the most popular drink with the locals is called pancha. Actually, the drink may be based on an Indian drink that's called punch, or in England, they call it punch. Basically, its name means five, and the drink is originally made with 5 separate ingredients, and there's some combination of distilled sugar alcohol, could be a rum, could be something else, but generally something like that, has honey, sugar, lemon rind, and various fruit juices. Now, the most common here is just lemon juice. And this little thing in the back is called a pau de pancha. That's the wooden stick that they use for properly blending the punch. It makes, it's called a muddler. In almost any other world, it's a muddler. The design was created here in Madeira. Here it's more commonly called the caralhinho, or little cock. They make great souvenirs. They come from Madeira. They're not all that expensive. You find them in almost every gift shop. Now, here's a little tidbit for you, because it's got such wonderful ingredients. Pancha cures the common cold. So we probably ought to have, a few, and that way we'll be protected. And it might cure other things. Yeah, we could try one now.